Imagine standing on a dock in the summer of 1845, watching two enormous wooden ships slip away from the shore of the Thames, their black hulls catching the gray light of an English morning, their masts cutting upward into a sky that seemed in that moment to hold nothing but promise. The crowds cheered, the men on deck waved their caps, someone's wife held a handkerchief to her mouth. And then the ships grew smaller and smaller against the horizon, until the water swallowed them whole, and 129 men sailed out of the world and into history. No one on that dock could have known, not truly, not in their bones, that most of those people waving back were already sailing toward their deaths, that the ice waiting for them in the Arctic was not an obstacle to be conquered, but a tomb to be entered. That the greatest naval expedition Britain had ever sent into the frozen North would become the greatest mystery the frozen North had ever kept. This is the story of the Franklin expedition, and it is one of the most haunting, most heartbreaking, most enduringly strange stories in the entire history of human exploration. Sir John Franklin was not a young man when he was given command of this mission. He was 59 years old, heavy-set, white-haired, the kind of man whose face had been weathered by decades of cold water and cold wind. He had served in the Battle of Trafalgar as a teenager. He had sailed to the Arctic before twice and nearly died both times, including one overland expedition so catastrophic that his men had been reduced to eating lichen scraped from rocks and, according to some accounts, the leather from their own boots. The British press had given him a nickname after that ordeal, the man who ate his boots. It was not entirely flattering. But it was the kind of nickname that followed a man into legend, and Franklin wore it like a medal, because survival in his world was its own kind of glory. The mission he was now leading had a straightforward purpose, at least on paper. Britain had been hunting for the Northwest Passage for centuries, that fabled route through the Arctic waters of northern Canada, the one that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, the one that would reshape global trade, shorten journeys by thousands of miles, give the nation that controlled it a kind of commercial and strategic power that made empires salivate. Explorers had been trying and failing and dying in pursuit of it for so long that the map of the Canadian Arctic was essentially a patchwork of their suffering, each new expedition adding a few miles of coastline before the ice pushed them back, or the winter swallowed them, or the scurvy took their teeth and then their lives. But by 1845 the British were convinced they were close. So close. Just a few hundred miles of uncharted water stood between what was known and what was needed, and the men in the Admiralty believed that two well-provisioned, technologically advanced ships, commanded by an experienced officer, could close that gap in a single season. The two ships chosen for the mission were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and you need to understand what these ships were because they were not ordinary sailing vessels. They were bomb ships, originally built to fire heavy mortars in naval bombardments, which meant their hulls had been reinforced far beyond what any normal ship required, reinforced to absorb the tremendous concussive shock of their own weapons. That structural fortification made them uniquely suited to the ice, and both vessels had already been to the ends of the earth, quite literally. Erebus and Terror had sailed to Antarctica just 4 years earlier under the command of James Clark Ross, and they had come back. They were proven ships, tough ships, ships with a history of surviving the unsurvivable, which must have felt like a good omen to the men who stepped aboard them in the spring of 1845. And the preparations for this expedition were extraordinary by the standards of the era. The ships were loaded with enough food to last 3 years. Tinned provisions, 8,000 cans of meat and vegetables and soup, all sealed with lead solder, which would prove to be one of the darkest ironies of the whole catastrophe, but we will get to that. There were books, thousands of books, a library of over 1,200 volumes including bound copies of Punch magazine and the complete works of Charles Dickens. There were musical instruments. There was a hand organ that could play 50 tunes. There was a daguerreotype camera. There was a steam-powered heating system in the officers' quarters. There were dress uniforms and china plates and silver cutlery engraved with the officers' initials, because the Royal Navy conducted its explorations with a particular kind of ceremonial stubbornness, an insistence on civilized ritual even at the edge of the known world, as if the act of eating soup from a proper bowl with a proper spoon would hold the wilderness at bay. Franklin departed from Greenhithe on the 19th of May, 1845. They stopped in Greenland in July, where they were last seen by the crew of two whaling ships, the Enterprise and Prince of Wales, floating in Baffin Bay, waiting for favorable winds to carry them west. The whalers reported that the crew seemed in good spirits, that the ships looked well provisioned, that everything appeared to be in order. One of the whalers shook hands with Franklin himself and later said the man seemed confident, cheerful, ready. And then Erebus and Terror sailed into Lancaster Sound and the Arctic closed around them like a door, and that was the last time any outside observer saw them alive. For 2 years, no one in Britain worried very much. These things took time. The Arctic was vast and the seasons were long, and Franklin had provisions for 3 years, and the mission had always been understood as a multi-year endeavor. The men's families wrote letters that could not be delivered to an address no one knew. The Admiralty tracked the days with patient confidence, and the Arctic said nothing, gave nothing back, just ice and silence and the long polar night rolling in from the north like a verdict. By 1847, the anxiety began to sharpen. No word, no returning ships, no messages left at the prearranged cache points that other expeditions occasionally left at known waypoints. The silence had gone on too long. And Jane Franklin, the explorer's wife, a formidably intelligent and politically connected woman who refused with every fiber of her being to simply wait and grieve quietly, began to make noise. She wrote letters to anyone who might listen. She lobbied the Admiralty. She lobbied the Prime Minister. She was one of the most persistent and effective advocates in the history of Arctic exploration, and because of her the British government eventually did what it probably should have done sooner. It sent ships to find out what had happened. The first search expeditions left in 1848, and then more followed. Over the course of the next decade, dozens of ships and hundreds of men were sent into the Arctic looking for Franklin, making the search for the lost expedition one of the largest and most sustained rescue operations in the history of polar exploration. And what they found, slowly in fragments, in pieces that had to be assembled like a shattered mirror, was a picture of something that had gone wrong in ways that were almost impossible to comprehend. The first real breakthrough came not from a British ship, but from the Inuit, the indigenous people of the Arctic, who had been living in that landscape for thousands of years, who knew its rhythms and its dangers in ways that European sailors never quite managed to learn. Inuit communities began reporting to various search expeditions, encounters with large groups of white men walking southward across the ice, gaunt men, sick men, men who were dragging heavy boats on sledges across the snow. Men who were dying. The Inuit traded with them when they could, tried to communicate through the barrier of language, and watched with a particular kind of helpless sadness as the strangers walked on into the white distance and disappeared. Some Inuit reported finding the bodies of dead men in camps, in tents, frozen into poses that suggested they had simply stopped and sat down and not gotten up again. They found objects, silver cutlery engraved with initials, uniform buttons, pieces of navigational equipment, scattered across the ice like the remnants of a civilization that had tried to carry its civilization with it and failed. The most significant single discovery of the early search period came in 1850, when searchers found the expedition's first winter camp on Beechey Island, a bleak flat outcrop of rock in the Canadian Arctic. They found 3 graves there, just 3 out of a crew of 129, which meant that in the first winter most of the men were still alive. They found the detritus of a long encampment, hundreds of food cans, scraps of rope and canvas, the bones of animals. But no written records, no notes, no journals, nothing that explained what had happened or where the ships had gone after the winter ended. Just 3 headstones in the frozen ground and the Arctic silence pressing down from every direction. The names on those headstones, carved into dark stone that still stands on Beechey Island today, were John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. 3 young men ranging in age from 17 to 32 who had died in the first winter before the real catastrophe even began. And in 1984, a team of Canadian scientists did something extraordinary. They exhumed all 3 bodies and found them preserved almost perfectly by the permafrost, frozen so completely that one of them, Torrington, looked almost as if he might wake up. What the scientists found when they examined these men was deeply troubling. The bodies showed signs of severe malnutrition, of tuberculosis, of pneumonia, but they also showed extraordinarily high levels of lead. Lead in the bones, in the hair, in the tissue, in concentrations that were consistent with severe and chronic lead poisoning. And this is where the tinned food comes back in. The 8,000 cans of provisions loaded onto Erebus and Terror had been sealed with lead solder, applied in thick, uneven blobs by a contractor named Stephen Goldner who had been given the contract late and completed it in a rush. When those cans corroded, which they had begun to do almost immediately, they leached lead into the food inside them. And every meal those men ate was quietly poisoning them. Lead poisoning at those levels doesn't just kill you. It makes you lose your mind first. It causes confusion, paranoia, fatigue, impaired judgment, erratic behavior, the kind of mental deterioration that could make a group of experienced naval officers make decisions that otherwise make no sense at all. Because some of the decisions that the Franklin expedition made in the end make very little sense. The one written record that was ever found, discovered in 1859 by an expedition led by Francis McClintock, which had been funded almost entirely by the tireless Jane Franklin, told a story of choices that seem, to modern eyes, almost inexplicable. The record was a standard Admiralty form, the kind of document expedition officers were supposed to fill out and deposit in cairns at regular intervals, and this one had been written on twice, the first time in the summer of 1847 and the second time in April of 1848. The first note, written in a neat hand, reported that all was well. The ships had been beset, frozen into the ice, for the winter of 1846 to 1847. They were at a position north of King William Island. Sir John Franklin was in command. Total of ship's company, 129 souls, all well. The second note, scrawled in the margins in a different, shakier hand, told a completely different story. Sir John Franklin had died on the 11th of June, 1847. 24 other men had died by that point as well. The ships had been locked in the ice for a year and a half. On the 22nd of April, 1848, the 105 survivors had abandoned the ships and were beginning a march south across the ice toward the Back River, on the Canadian mainland. It was signed by the two surviving senior officers, Captain Francis Crozier and Captain James Fitzjames. Think about what that note represents for a moment. 105 men. Sick, lead-poisoned, malnourished, scurvy-ridden men setting out to walk across one of the most hostile environments on Earth with no possibility of rescue, no knowledge that anyone was coming for them, dragging behind them on heavy wooden sledges not just their food and equipment, but inexplicably their boats. Full-sized naval boats, each weighing hundreds of pounds, loaded with silver plate and books and button polish and curtain rods, and all the paraphernalia of civilization that they could not bring themselves to leave behind. Why would men who were dying of exhaustion drag those weights across the ice? Was it the lead in their blood clouding their thinking? Was it discipline and training so deeply ingrained that even in extremity they followed the rules that had been drilled into them? Was it hope, the stubborn, irrational, very human hope that if they could just get to the water they could sail those boats to safety? McClintock's expedition found evidence of that march scattered across King William Island and the surrounding area. Skeletons, equipment, boats abandoned on the ice still loaded with their impossible cargo. One boat contained two skeletons surrounded by silver cutlery, chocolate, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, sponges, hair combs, and books. These men were dying on the ice and they were still carrying books. It is one of the most heartbreaking images in the entire history of exploration, those two unnamed men lying among their possessions, all that portable civilization, all that optimism turned to ballast, on the silent shore of a frozen island at the top of the world. The Inuit testimonies, collected over years by various searchers and painstakingly assembled by the American explorer Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s, added further terrible details. The Inuit described finding bodies in a tent, some of them showing evidence that the survivors had been, in the end, consuming the flesh of their dead companions. This was not unusual in extremis, not unique to this expedition, not something that should diminish our understanding of the desperation and suffering that drove men to it. But it was part of the story, confirmed later by forensic analysis of the bones that showed cut marks consistent with butchering, and it became one of the most contested and uncomfortable aspects of the entire Franklin saga, because the Victorian public was deeply reluctant to believe it, deeply invested in the image of their naval heroes dying with dignity, and the man who most loudly proclaimed it true, the explorer John Ray, who had first collected the Inuit accounts, was attacked and dismissed and never fully forgiven for what he had reported, even though history has entirely vindicated him. Not a single man from the Franklin expedition survived. All 129 of them died in the Arctic over a period of roughly 3 years, from 1845 to approximately 1848, though some individual survivors may have lasted a few months beyond that. The exact fate of the very last survivors has never been established with certainty. The bodies of the men, scattered across King William Island and the surrounding waters, were never recovered in any systematic way. Most of them are still there, somewhere under the ice or in the frozen ground, still holding the secrets of what exactly happened in those final terrible days. And yet the story did not end with their deaths, because the Franklin expedition left a different kind of legacy, one that had nothing to do with the Northwest Passage they failed to navigate. The dozens of search expeditions that were sent to find them collectively mapped more of the Canadian Arctic than all previous explorations combined. The act of looking for Franklin filled in the blanks on the map in a way that Franklin himself never could have. It is one of history's great ironies that the expedition which failed to complete its mission did more for Arctic cartography through the search for its remains than it ever could have through its success. And eventually, buried within the routes charted by those search vessels, the Northwest Passage itself was confirmed. It existed. Franklin's ships had actually come tantalizingly close to it, closer than anyone knew at the time. If they had not been beset in the ice, if the summer of 1846 had been a degree warmer, if the lead solder had not been applied in haste, if any one of a dozen things had been different, they might have made it through and come home as heroes, and the story would have been entirely different. But the ice did not care about any of that. The ice has no interest in what might have been. The story of the Franklin expedition did not end in the 19th century. It did not end in the 20th century either. The wreck of the Erebus and the wreck of the Terror, the two ships that carried those men into the ice, had never been found. For over 160 years they lay somewhere under the waters of the Canadian Arctic, undiscovered, their locations unknown, carrying within their frozen hulls whatever remained of the expedition's logs and journals and records, whatever written testimony those men had left behind. Every few years a new expedition would search for them. Every few years the Arctic would give nothing back. And then in September 2014, something extraordinary happened. A Canadian research vessel, part of a systematic survey funded by the Canadian government, and using modern sonar technology, discovered a wreck on the bottom of Victoria Strait in the waters around King William Island. The wreck was upright, well-preserved, lying in about 11 meters of water. It was HMS Erebus, Franklin's flagship, the ship that had carried him into the ice and out of the world. It had been sitting there, under the water, for approximately 166 years. And it was found, crucially, exactly where Inuit oral tradition had always said it would be. The Inuit had been telling searchers for over a century where the ships were, describing their locations in precise terms, and they had been largely dismissed or ignored. And when Erebus was finally located, it was in the precise area the Inuit had always indicated. HMS Terror was found 2 years later in 2016 in Terror Bay on the southwest coast of King William Island, also in the location Inuit sources had described, also remarkably well preserved, also upright on the seabed. And the condition of Terror in particular was astonishing. The hatches were closed. The windows were intact. The interior appeared to be largely undisturbed. Whatever is still inside that ship has been sitting undisturbed in the cold Arctic water for a century and a half. And the divers who have entered it have found things that no living person has ever seen before. Books on shelves, medicine bottles in the sick bay, a desk with its drawers still closed, the personal possessions of men who have been dead for generations. The journals and written records that might finally answer the deepest questions about what happened to the Franklin expedition may still be in there, preserved by the cold, waiting in the dark of that iron hull, waiting for someone to open the right drawer and bring the light back. The mystery is not fully solved. It may never be fully solved. We know approximately what happened and approximately when, but the fine-grained detail of those final days, the last entries in the last journals, the decisions made around fires that burned lower and lower until they went out entirely, those still belong to the ice. The Canadian government has been conducting careful, methodical underwater archaeology on both wrecks, and every diving season brings new discoveries, new artifacts, new fragments of the story. It is one of the most remarkable ongoing archaeological excavations in the world, happening not in a desert or a jungle, but on the floor of the Arctic Ocean, conducted by divers in dry suits who can spend only brief periods in the water before the cold forces them back to the surface. But the story of the Franklin expedition is not really about archaeology, not at its heart. It is about something older and simpler than that. It is about what happens when human ambition meets an environment that does not share human ambitions. It is about the particular cruelty of hope, the way it can carry men forward past the point where they should have turned back, and the way it can sustain them right up until the moment it cannot sustain them anymore. Those 129 men who sailed out of the Thames on a May morning were not fools. They were not reckless. They were the best equipped, best provisioned expedition Britain had ever sent to the Arctic, and they went with the full confidence of the most powerful navy in the world behind them, and the ice did not care. The Arctic does not negotiate. It does not reward confidence or preparation or good intentions. It simply is what it is, vast and cold and indifferent, and the men who enter it do so on its terms, not their own. John Franklin died, we believe, of unknown causes in June of 1847, before the abandonment of the ships, before the death march, before the worst of it. His body has never been found. His grave is somewhere in the Arctic, unmarked, unknown, perhaps on one of the ships now resting on the seabed, perhaps somewhere on the ice and stone of King William Island. The cenotaph erected in his honor in London's Waterloo Place carries an inscription written at the insistence of his wife, the woman who spent the rest of her life ensuring he was remembered. The inscription reads in part, "Who forged the last link of the Northwest Passage with his life." It is a generous reading of a catastrophic failure, but it is not an entirely wrong one. The passage was there, he had come close, and the search for him had finished the map. Jane Franklin outlived her husband by nearly 30 years. She spent much of that time and much of her own fortune-funding expeditions to find out what had happened to him, and she lived long enough to see McClintock bring back the record, to learn the broad outlines of the disaster, to receive confirmation of what she must have known in her heart for years. She never stopped advocating for his memory. She never accepted any narrative that cast him as responsible for the catastrophe. She was 90 years old when she died in 1875, and she died, as far as anyone could tell, still believing that her husband had died as a hero. The men who sailed with him believed it too. Whatever the lead was doing to their minds, whatever the confusion and the pain and the terrible cold were doing to their bodies, they marched south towards safety with discipline and with purpose and with the portraits of their wives in their coat pockets, and they died trying. All 129 of them. In the ice, at the edge of the world. In the place where the map ran out and the white space began, that enormous, merciless, silent white space that swallowed them whole and kept them for a century and a half and is only now, very slowly, beginning to give them back. The ice remembers everything. And eventually, if you are patient enough, if you listen closely enough to the people who have lived there for thousands of years and know its rhythms and its secrets, if you send the right technology down into the right stretch of cold, dark water, the ice will tell you what it knows. Not all of it, not all at once, but enough. Enough to understand that 129 men sailed into the frozen north on a bright May morning in 1845 and were never seen again, and that their story, their real story, is still being written, one artifact at a time, one dive at a time, in the cold and the dark at the bottom of an Arctic sea. And that is something that no amount of time, no amount of ice, no amount of silence can ever make anything other than extraordinary.